Great. So thank you very much, Marco. When we first started talking about what to present as the Greentech Alliance at NOAH, we realized that we're actually in a very unique position because the Greentech Alliance has grown super fast into a network of more than 2,000 Greentech founders globally and more than 500 advisors. And we now claim that we're the largest Greentech startup network that exists on this planet, and we are in a position to actually understand what's happening with this space in various areas. And today we want to present to you a study we initiated particularly for NOAH to report back to the investment scene on what's happening with Greentech startups. And important to understand is that the respondents of our study were 33% based in Germany, because that's where the largest part of our member base is located. 65% of the respondents to our study were in Europe, and the remaining 35% internationally. So just when you're looking at the data with us now, please be aware that it's slightly skewed based on the respondents. But the amazing news is that we managed to actually get 10% of our members to respond to this study, and we have a very valid data set here to report back on what's happening in this space. Also interesting to understand is that out of those 200 Greentech startups, the median money raised so far is around €500,000. So we're mainly looking at funded pre-seed startups. The average, though, is around 2 million, and these 200 startups have raised a total of 350 million. Also interesting to understand about this data set is that 25% of the startups were actually founded by women. You might not be aware, but overall, according to Crunchbase, 20% of startups are being founded by women at the moment. So we have a slightly higher female founder rate here in the Greentech startup scene. And also 35% of the teams were made up of women. So we're seeing 35 to 65 ratio here. And now my colleague Jan-Jaap is going to share with you some of the key findings. And yeah, Jan-Jaap, what will we be able to find out?
Yes, thank you, Hannah. And first of all, maybe on the topic of the women founders, because what is very interesting is that overall, if you look at investments in female founders, at the moment it's touching on 6-7% max that receive venture capital. In our alliance, in the data set that we have, we see at the moment a rate of around 18%, so that's a very positive one to start with. Now, going further, what you're looking at here is who received what kind of funding. And one thing that really stands out is that 43% of all those members have received grants. Now, to put that into perspective, we've been doing some research. I couldn't find an exact number, but any number that was to be found was somewhere between 2 to 7% of startups that received funding had used the vehicle as a grant, or had used the grant as a vehicle. This 42%, and what that says is that you can almost argue that the go-to-market of these members and of these Greentech companies is different. It also says that probably they rely on grants because it's very hard to access any kind of private capital. Now, we do see that a lot of them also have raised angel rounds and also eventually have raised VC rounds. But I think this is really telling about what's going on. And next to that, we're presenting some highlights or insights on the stage today. We'll also release a report with much more detail where we can go deeper into these kind of numbers. Another one is just to give you a bit of perspective, what are Greentech companies? And what's interesting to see is that there's a lot of circularity and lifestyle businesses that are in the Greentech space. And furthermore, there's so many different industries at play. For a lot of people, I'm one of them, like you think about Greentech, you think about carbon accounting, carbon offsetting, but actually what we see here, it's mostly circularity, it's mobility, it's waste management, and only then comes carbon. Another one is, like, where do they struggle the most? And there's no big surprises here. 67% says, okay, my biggest challenge by far actually is getting funding, getting to the next stage in my journey over and over again. And usually, as a reminder, like starting with the grant. The other one is actually getting access to new customers, which also relates to actually getting to go to market. What we see predominantly in this space is that a lot of founders have non-business backgrounds, very technical, sustainability driven. They do not always find the ways to how to capture a new market, how to enter a new market. And this is also one of the reasons why next to the 2,000 members, we have 500 plus advisors that predominantly help on these kind of areas. Then another one, which I think is true for everyone who is scaling an organization, is hiring. There's no surprise there. Another thing that we've been looking into is not only like, okay, what are you doing in terms of investments? What is your team set up? But also like, how do you measure impact yourself? How do you essentially make sure that you're, from an investor perspective, have the right numbers? Now, overall, it's very diverse, and we created this word bubble, and usually you see some that are very big and some that are very small, but overall it was very diverse, and a lot of them look into emissions, but it could be avoided emissions, it could be reduced emissions, it could just be the emissions you're accounting for, but also trees planted, and then another one very much focused on water. What also became very clear is that there's no general consensus, there's no framework yet to really measure impact. And I think this correlates again to the struggle of actually getting funding. It's very hard for any kind of business in the green tech space to really show on paper what is my impact, and for that reason, why should you invest? Lastly, another part of impact is, okay, but how do you measure impact yourself? Isn't like you're a business as well. Do you account for your own activities? And here it is very overwhelming. Like 63% of businesses actually they measure emissions. A lot of them do offsetting. A lot of them do everything themselves. To again put this into context, because it's important to put all these numbers into context. On average, a pre-seed, seed, Series A business, this number would be absolutely flipped, or even like less than 30% of businesses in this stage would even think about it, let alone act on it. What we see here is that green tech businesses really like they try to practice what they preach. Now, we've shared some data, and I know, Marco, you love the data, but we also want to share some stories maybe that we gotten from members on how do they reflect on these numbers? Like, what do they see as challenges, and does this actually match up? Hannah, do you have an example maybe that you can share?
Yeah, I think especially when I think about our members who are in the carbon offsetting space, I think what I'm observing is that there's a lot of green tech startups that require very, very high asset investments upfront at a very high risk. And I think this is an example of why we're seeing such a high amount of members going for grants initially, because for private investment, from my view and my observation at least, this combination of high investment and high risk is very tricky, especially at pre-seed, and maybe this is why some of our members aren't commercially viable investments yet, and that's why the grants make up such a such a large part. But Jan-Jaap, can you think of an actual member that you could talk about briefly before we finish the presentation?
Yeah, I actually want to highlight two. Because last year, it was the first year of the Earthshot Prize. I think many of you have heard of it. One of our members won, and what that did was open doors to every single thing. They also relied on grants, and then they got funding. But actually, what that did is it got them on a almost like on a podium, and suddenly they were certified, verified, anything like that. Now, that member was in Apter, and what's really cool. This week there was another Earthshot Prize. Actually, the one that won. There's 6 winners, but the one that won in terms of plastic reduction is Notpla. Pierre, the founder, he was here actually yesterday very briefly. His schedule immediately turned around because suddenly it's very hot property. But what we see is that the moment that actually there's recognition on products that, and these are hardware businesses, products that rely on a lot of development and such, and suddenly when such a price comes into play, their entire existence changes for the better. So it also comes to another topic, and that's not shown in the challenges, but it's something that is kind of underlying, and with that I want to finish, is that they do not get the podium enough. They do not get enough time, not only here today, and Marco, I really appreciate that you put so many Greentech companies here on stage in the last 2 days, but also just like in the press, everywhere. It's always being considered as something that is outside of the normal. It's not something that, it's not a SaaS business, it's not something that can scale easy, but, and with that I really finish, we also got to remember that everything that we're trying to do in the Greentech space is usually not that easy. And what I would like to invite everyone here today is not only to later look into the study, but also to really make sure that you can lift up these entrepreneurs because they really need it. Thank you.